You find the Pharaoh of the Exodus by asking the right question. It is absolutely stunning to me how many scholars, zero, that would be, have ever asked the right question regarding the Exodus event. Okay? And the operative question is, right here. If all those really terrible things happened to Egypt that the Bible describes, what would have happened to Egypt? Okay? Now, let me back up. I don't have them all here. I don't know. Well, this is a really short version of this presentation. I always say there are 5 things. The obvious one is what? Plagues. I put all 10 plagues under the same point. Okay? Plagues. They plundered the Egyptians, at least in the Delta region where they lived. Okay? They left, so labor, loss of labor, loss of a rather substantial labor force. They lost, Egypt lost all of its northern army basically. 600 prime chariots, a bunch of other chariots, marching men. Pretty much a good chunk of the northern army of Amun-Ra got drowned in the sea. And if Psalms is to be taken historically, the Pharaoh died. Not like the movie.
And they lost the firstborn male of everyone in Egypt.
Yeah, but that's the plagues. That's in the plagues. So, I mean, if all those things converge, the 10 plagues and all those other 5 things all converge within a few months on Egypt, I don't care what period it's in, Egypt is going to suffer a collapse. Whatever dynasty is in power at the time is going to collapse. So if you pick a Pharaoh of the Exodus, I don't care who it is and I don't care what you think. If Egypt didn't collapse at the death of after the death of that Pharaoh, you don't have the right Pharaoh. Period. End of discussion. Now, my colleagues who hold to other pharaohs that don't tend to like that particular approach, but it's just true. And I always ask them, some people take Moses III. Well, point to the collapse at or near the death of Moses III. He can't. In fact, when he died, Egypt got stronger, as we shall see, and on and on. So we just have to find the right historical moment. So let's go on and see what that is. Now, let's look at the ancient Near East during the Hyksos period. Now, the Hyksos period is a time when Egypt had suffered a collapse of sorts at the end of the Middle Kingdom period, or the Middle Bronze Age. And they had been taken over by Asiatic Semites. Semitic Asiatics, mainly from Canaan, had come down into the land and taken over Egypt from the native Egyptians. How well do you think that sat with the native population? But they had come down here. Remember when Abraham came into Egypt with famine and all that? The same famine that drove Abraham and his family, ultimately Jacob, into Egypt for permanent residency, drove untold tens of thousands of them to Egypt. And they took up residence there. One day they woke up, and I think they said something like, gee, there's like 10 of us to every one native Egyptian. How come they're in charge and we're not? And they took over. And for the next, about a couple hundred years almost. By the way, it actually probably started a little bit earlier, but 1700 to 1550 is a pretty good run. So 150 years or so, they're in charge. But then something happened. Whoops, I'll go the right direction. Now, this is Hyksos, Egypt. They controlled Lower Egypt. By the way, at this time, Upper Egypt. Don't you hate that? Because when I think of lower, I think of south. When I think of upper, I think of north.
Yeah.
But this is done by the way the Nile flows. So, Lower Egypt is in the north, Upper Egypt is in the south. But Upper Egypt, the Theban dynasties, the Theban dynasties of the native Egyptians, were actually paying tribute as vassal to the Hyksos state. Okay? But notice that the Hyksos Empire goes all the way up into past the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. So they're basically controlling what we call the southern Levant. Right? So Theban Egypt is there in the south. Now there's another kingdom up here. What's real fun about Old Testament scholars is that most of them have never heard of this kingdom. I've given lectures at different places, and the Old Testament scholars come up after and they say, "We've never heard of the Mitanni." Well, that's why your Pharaoh of the Exodus is wrong. Because they're a major player here. The Mitanni kingdom, very important. There's another kingdom, Assyria. At this point in time, Assyria is a vassal of Mitanni.
What are they doing way over there?
Who?
Assyria.
That's Assyria.
That is where Assyria is.
It is Assyria.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Middle Mesopotamia,
I
Assyria.
my mind.
Yeah. And there's another kingdom up there, Hatti. Now technically it's Hatti. That'll give you a sore throat if you say it very much. So Hatti is good enough. These are the Hittites. This is the land of Het, or the Hattians. So these are the players. And this is how we find out who the Pharaoh of the Exodus is. Oh, by the way, if you want to find out who the Pharaoh of the Exodus is, don't ask the Egyptians.
Right.
Oh, they're not, yeah.
Because they are not going to admit failure, weakness, because any admission of failure or weakness invites not only internal rebellion, but also possible conquest from outside. Because your enemies are always reconnoitering you, and they know your strengths and weaknesses. So you want to cover the weaknesses up as much as possible. Now, what I'm going to give you here, in order to find the Pharaoh of the Exodus, we need to understand the history of the 18th dynasty. So let's do a thumbnail quickie review of the 18th dynasty. Now, if you want to see this all in detail, in more gory detail probably than you really ever need, you can get my little book, Let My People Go, using historical synchronisms to discover the Pharaoh of the Exodus.
Which is an excellent book, by the way.
And it's just short, and I have lots of
Already.
complaints about it. That, wow, it's a little short book, but like, can't you make it fun? It's a piece of academic research.
It was good.
Okay, and academics cannot be fun. But all right, now,
All right, there you have it.
License expired.
I hate the malware. Go away.
Your free trial.
All right. When Ahmose came to power, his goal was to kick the Hyksos out of Egypt. His predecessor had tried, but we have all the mummies, by the way, the 18th dynasty guys, and even the one preceding him. His predecessor has a sickle sword hacked through his skull. Compliments of a Hyksos warrior. So his predecessor wasn't successful, but Ahmose kicked the Hyksos out of Egypt. He reunified Upper and Lower Egypt. And by the way, it's always two kingdoms, Upper and Lower. When you're a king of Egypt, you wear two crowns, one of Upper Egypt, one of Lower Egypt. And by the way, in the Bible, just a little aside, in the Bible, the Egypt that you always read about, the Egypt that Abraham dealt with, the Egypt that Jacob went to, and so on, is only Lower Egypt. It's the Hyksos Egypt, the Semitic Egypt, not this Egypt. So Ahmose kicks them out. And he rules for, how long did he rule for? 24 years. Pretty good run. His son...
And he died at 110, right?
No, he's not a noble.
Oh.
He's a pharaoh. Amenhotep I gets 21 years. he doesn't do much, except they're putting the infrastructure of Egypt back together. They're putting the administration. They're putting the agriculture back together. They're getting the kingdom back. They're growing back strength again after this, what's called the second intermediate period when the Semitic Asiatics took over. By the time we get to Tutmosis I, Egypt has been put back together. It is extremely strong. It has established again its strength in the south and in the north. However, it is simply living within its traditional borders. And by the way, the traditional border is basically like 2 miles on each side of the Nile for 1,000 miles. So it's a pretty long, ribbon-like skinny kingdom. But Tutmosis I woke up one morning and he thought to himself, things are good. I think I need an empire. I think I need to conquer some folks. And that's what he sets out to do. In fact, he gets it in his head that he wants to drive the border of Egypt all the way north to the Euphrates River. So he wants to take it north and east of the Euphrates River. Now, he does that. But there's a problem. When he goes to the north, there's another very, very strong kingdom in the north controlling northern Mesopotamia, and it's called the Mitanni Kingdom. And when he goes up there, they have to deal with them. Notice how they, let me back up, notice how they overlap. Why? Because Mitanni has the same advantage in their position in the world that Egypt has. Egypt has access to the Mediterranean trade. The Mitannis have access to the Mediterranean trade. Now, their kingdom is really just between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, but actually, they control all the city-states. These are all vassals of Mitanni. So Mitanni has access to the sea. This is a good economic situation. And to have the Egyptians poking their nose up in and blocking access to the corridor to the sea is not a good thing for Mitanni. So what happens is, you suppose every time the Egyptians come and poke their nose into Mitanni territory, Egypt has to fight the Mitannis. And so actually what happens is that Egypt comes up here, and remember, Tutmosis is not interested in anything east of the Euphrates. He's only interested in driving his border to the Euphrates. I don't know why he picked that, but that's what he picked. And so what he does is he comes up here with his army, and he gets all the big city-states here, all the city-state kings, to sign little agreements as his vassal. But about the time he turns around and takes his army back to Egypt, I mean, right as they go over the horizon, they're re-signing up with Mitanni. So this empire of Tutmosis I is more in his head than in reality. So it's kind of a wish, but he can't make it stick. The Mitannis are going to take back that territory every time he leaves town. Now, Tutmosis II continues the same kind of thing, but again, the kingdom is more on paper than it is solidly in reality, because the Mitannis are not going to let him have that border. By the way, look, there's a pretty short reign. When Tutmosis II dies, his wife, Hatshepsut, heard of her? The female pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, who always wanted to be king, not queen, king. She was queen, she wanted to be king. And so most people think she was slipping a little glass into her husband's oatmeal. Notice that his reign is quite short. And he dies, and she takes over. Now, she is not the chosen son. She's not the crown. There is a crown prince, and his name is Tutmosis III, but he's only 7 years old. And obviously, he can't come to the to the throne. So she rules in his stead. Now she's not his mother. He's from another queen, and but Auntie Hatshepsut, as we might call her, decides that he needs a regent, a co-regent, to sort of take care of things, and that's what happens. She steps onto the throne and is a tough cookie, and she rules Egypt well for 20 years. Okay? But then something happens. Tutmosis, by the time he reaches about age 27, in the 20th year or so of Hatshepsut's reign, he wakes up one morning, I think, out in the field, because he, in fact, has been her commander up here, commanding the northern armies of Amun-Ra, and keeping a strong, iron-fisted control of all of this region. 19 or so different campaigns, 19 that we know about, campaigns that he launches into this area. And I think one day he woke up and thought, maybe itching from a few fleas in his tent or something, and he thought, I'm the Pharaoh of Egypt. I was the crown prince, my father is dead. Why am I up here bivouacked with my troops in Syria, and my Aunt Hatshepsut is down on the throne ruling Egypt? That's what I'm supposed to be doing. Well, I think that's what he thought. Well, we don't know exactly what happened, but the next thing we know is that Hatshepsut is dead, and all of her name and faces are being hacked off the monuments of Egypt. I think we don't have to look too far for a culprit to that. So, now thankfully for Tutmosis III, he's going to have a good long life. He's going to rule in his own right for the next 34 years, which by itself is longer than his predecessors. So technically his reign is 54 years, but he spends the first 20 of it commanding the armies in the north, and then he spends 34 years on his own. Now, this is the greatest Pharaoh without compare in the history of Egypt. He makes Ramses look like a Sunday school boy. Tutmosis III is the grandest, greatest, wealthiest Pharaoh with the most powerful army and the most territory of any Pharaoh in the history of Egypt, before him or after him. He is the grandest guy of all. If I had to be a Pharaoh in Egypt, if I had to go back to the ancient world and live, that's what I want to be. Tutmosis III, he had it all going for him.
So why'd Ramses get all the publicity?
They made a movie.
Now, notice that he keeps a strong Egyptian hegemony. At this time, Egypt can truly say their border is the Euphrates River. Mitanni is snuffed. And so it's a good situation. But all good things must come to an end. What do you suppose happens to all those collective city-states in Canaan and Syria when a Pharaoh dies? Rebellion. Why? Because when you're a vassal of Egypt, you have to give away your good stuff for free. Two hugely important commodities in ancient Egypt. In ancient Canaan. What were they? Wine of Canaan, and olive oil. Olives are indigenous to Canaan. It's the best oil there is. And wine. And Egypt could get those things for free by tribute when they were in control. But when a pharaoh dies, there's rebellion. Because they don't want to give Egypt all this stuff for free. So they run out, kill the Egyptian governor, and break off from Egypt. Well, every pharaoh in the 18th dynasty, when his father dies, every new pharaoh has to go take care of business in Syria and bring everybody back under their thumb. Well, Amenhotep II was a tough guy, and when Tutmosis III died, he has to go up into Canaan and take care of business. There were 7 principal Syrian princes up in this area who rebelled When they did, he marched his armies up. He took a flotilla of ships up this way and marched his armies up the coast to Syria. He hunted down the 7 city-state kings, hauled them over to the coast, hung them by their hands over the side of his ship, kept them wet and fed, hanging on the side of his ship alive, all the way down the Nile back to Thebes. When they got to Thebes, Tutmosis, who said, Amenhotep II, who says that no one can draw my bow. His composite bow was so strong that it said that nobody could pull it but him. I mean, this guy is really short. He looks like Vic. He's short and wide. You know, he's a strong guy, and he's tough. And what did he do? He personally took those 7 kings from Syria, took them into the Theban temple at Luxor, and had a big ceremony in which he didn't have somebody else do it, he personally cuts their heads off. And then has their bodies carved up in little pieces with little notes stuck to them and delivered all up and down Canaan and Syria. Don't mess with Amenhotep, or this is what happens. Egypt didn't have any more trouble after this, too much. The rebellion. And he's a thug. He's a tough guy. Not that Dick's a thug. Now, when he dies, when Amenhotep II dies, another pharaoh comes to the throne that is arguably the greatest pharaoh in the history of Egypt. Even greater than Tutmosis III for one thing. Maybe equal in other ways, but maybe a little bit above him for one reason. He is the first diplomat. He is a true diplomat. Because what he thinks is this: we're having to always fight for this territory to keep it. We're having to fight the Mitannis. And why don't I just take a queen from the king of Mitanni, become his brother, and then we can live happily ever after. Because they're our brother, we'll give them access to the sea, which is what they want. And not only that, but Mitanni can then officially recognize the northern border of Egypt as the Euphrates River. Diplomacy is born, and it works. Peace, prosperity, everybody's doing great. But now there's a little kink here, because Tutmosis IV had a choice. And the choice was, for about 100 years, the Mitannian envoys and the Hattian envoys have been working with Egypt to try to get a treaty. Hatti wants the treaty. Why? Because they don't have any access to the Mediterranean. The kingdom of Kikuwada here, in the Taurus Mountains, there's no access to the sea. They want the Mediterranean trade. The only way to get it is to control this territory. But Mitanni has it pretty well locked up. If they could get an agreement with Egypt, it would be the Egypto-Hattian alliance, and the Hittites would be gloriously happy, and the Egyptians would be happy, and Mitanni would be really upset. But Tutmosis didn't take that route. He took this route. He makes a deal with Mitanni. Before the ink is dry on this treaty, Hatti has now become the sworn enemy of Egypt. They are not. There's nothing they can do about it. This combined strength of Mitanni, the Mitanni and Egypt alliance is going to cut them out for a good long time, and they're not happy campers. All right. So we have the Egypto-Mitannian alliance. The Hittites are cut out of the picture, and that sets up the next step. Now, when Tutmosis IV dies, I want you to watch what happens. Now, we only have year 8 as the highest attested date for Tutmosis IV, year 8. Can't go any higher than that. So he only rules 8 to 10 years. Now watch what happens when he dies. almost instantly the Egypto-Mitannian alliance evaporates. Egypt pulls all of its forces out of the Levant. Look how long he rules. Just mark that 38 years in the back of your mind for a minute. He rules for 38 years, but during that time, Egypt has completely withdrawn from the Levant for some reason. Not only that, King Tushratta, who is the then king of Mitanni, keeps writing letters to Amenhotep III about this treaty that he had struck, that his father had struck with Amenhotep III's father. Where's the gold? Egypt had so much gold. He says, Egypt has gold as much as sand. Where are my gold shipments? And they're not talking. Egypt is not communicating for some reason. They have had a border on the Euphrates River for several generations now. And I think if Amenhotep III could have kept it, he would have. But for some reason, he seems not to have been able to keep the border. He withdraws from Asia. Now,
Pardon my ignorance, but
Yes.
what's a Levant?
Levant is everything in the eastern end of the Mediterranean between Egypt and Mesopotamia.
It's the Holy Land.
This is the Levant, from the Euphrates to Egypt. Okay? All the livable territory of the Levant. Now, what's interesting is that in the 20th year of Amenhotep III, Subi-Luli-Uma, it's a great dog name, by the way. Subi-Luli-Uma, the king of Hatti, the great warrior king of Hatti, marches across the Euphrates River with impunity and destroys Washukani, the capital of the Mitanni, without fear of Egyptian reprisal. What does he know? The Egyptians are not Hellenes. So he does that. Now, Mitanni is reduced to basically a few little few little city-states just hanging on by a thread. The capital is gone. Tushratta actually fled to Assyria. And Hatti got what it always wanted. They got it by force. But why did they think they could make this move at this point in history? Because they could never make it when Egypt was strong and when Mitanni was in alliance with Egypt. They never tried. But all of a sudden, they felt that they could attack Egypt and take the territory they had always wanted without fear of Egyptian reprisal. This happens, historically pretty quickly. All right, now, Assyria then starts it's now cut loose from Mitanni. It's no longer a vassal, and now it begins its rise in the world. Now comes along Pharaoh Akhenaten, who, by the way, dumped the Egyptian gods and began the world's one of the world's interesting religions, a monotheism based on a new god in Egypt that was not a god before, Aten. Aten was simply the sun disk, just the physical sun disk in the sky. He dumps all of the other gods, Amun-Ra, the big god, and all the other gods, and he invents a god, Aten. And Aten is a loving god. It's really interesting. We don't have time to go into it, but it's a loving, personal God, a God who shows loving kindness. Kind of sounds like, the God of the Israelites. But I think this is a response to something that happened, Moses and the Exodus, but we'll see how that pans out. Now, King Tut, his son, comes to the throne. By the way, during the reign of Akhenaten, Egypt has no foreign policy whatsoever. They have no presence in Canaan, no presence in the south, toward Cush in the south. And Egypt is basically collapsing around its ears, and guess what else is raving? Plagues are raving. Plagues started in the latter part of the reign of Thutmose IV. They ravaged Egypt all during the reign of Amenhotep III, and they were still causing problems in the time of King Tut. This is the famous boy king, King Tut, who only rules for 9 years, but when he dies, his widow, Ankhesenamun, does something really bizarre. She writes a letter. Remember, she's God's wife, they call her, principal queen of Egypt. Her husband is now dead. And she writes a letter to Suppiluliuma. Now remember, they're the sworn enemies of Egypt. But she writes a letter to Suppiluliuma seeking aid to secure her position in Egypt. Here's what she says. I'll just quote the letter. Dear Suppi, that's how it starts. My husband has died. I have no son. We have no sons. I hear you have many sons. If you will send one of your sons to be my husband, he will be Pharaoh of Egypt. Kooky. In fact, the annals of the Hittites say that when Suppiluliuma got this letter, he marched up and down ranting with hitting himself on the head in his palace going, what is happening? This has never happened to me in my whole life. What are they trying to pull? And he's really upset. What do I do with this? This has never happened in the history of the world, as far as we know. What's she asking? She's asking him to make, she's offering Egypt as a vassal state to the enemy Hittites in order to save her neck, save her throne. This is weird stuff. Well, he sends an envoy, he sends a diplomatic group down to Egypt, and they meet with her, and now she's upset because she thinks she's not being taken seriously. And so she writes another letter and sends back the envoy back to Suppiluliuma, and this time it's the same letter, but just with a few little punctuations. She says like this, I said, my husband died, we have no sons, you have many sons, who else have I appealed to? Have I embarrassed Egypt in the face of any other kingdom? No, you're the one I appeal to. And his guys come back and they go, it's legit. He says, okay, sends one of his sons down. As soon as that son crosses into Egyptian territory, he's assassinated. Not by her people, probably by Horemheb's people. But at that moment, this is the end of the 18th dynasty. The collapse began with the death of Thutmose IV, and this is the end of it. It's now defunct. Very bad stuff. Now, at that point, Horemheb, who's been a general in the army for a long time, actually puts one of his little buddies, Pharaoh I, on the throne for a couple of years, one of his military buddies. But he eventually takes the throne himself and rules for 28 years, beginning the 19th dynasty of Egypt. Okay. Now, in the time of Ramesses, now we've got Ramesses, who is also appointed by Horemheb to succeed him, and then Seti I, and then Ramesses, or Yul Brynner. Now Ramesses pushes up in, by the way, the Hittites are never dislodged from that position in Canaan. What's interesting is that eventually Ramesses comes up and butts heads with him by trying to take some of the coastal areas, and they fight with the Hittites, and eventually, guess who gets a treaty? The Hittites and the Egyptians. Fine. Which kind of works until the collapse of both kingdoms at the end of the late Bronze Age. So, they fight, but then they make up, and now, here's what I think. The collapse of Egypt's mighty 18th dynasty was a result of those 5 core events of the Exodus. Now watch what happens if you lay it out. Here they are, 5 things, okay? By the way, sorry for the Delta Force, but they're in the Delta of Egypt. We'll call them the Delta Force. Now, here are the power ratings for all the 18th dynasty kings in Egypt based on the strength of one thing, their control over Canaan and Syria. How good, how solid, firm was their control over Canaan and Syria? Here it is. Remember, he's just kingdom building within his own borders, so very small. Amenhotep II, maybe a little bit of influence, mostly economic. Tutmosis I sort of drives his armies through the region, but he can't really control it. It's more of an economic advantage. And Tutmosis II as well. But when Tutmosis III comes to power, we have Egypt driving to its height, completely controlling the Levant. And Amenhotep actually pushes it up a notch with his ferocity. Egypt has no decline. It's getting stronger and meaner as we go, until we get to Tutmosis IV, who pulls off this little diplomatic stunt, which works brilliantly to bring Mitanni and Egypt together. But watch what happens when Tutmosis IV dies. The control of Syria and Canaan just collapses. So there is a precipitous decline at the point, I think, of the Exodus events, which leads eventually to the collapse of Egypt. And there you go. I'm going to chase it. There's a few other slides, but that's the point. There's only one. What would have happened to Egypt if the Exodus events actually occurred? That you can't find this scenario anywhere else in the entire history, from the beginning of the 18th dynasty to the end of the 19th dynasty, encompassing all the possible dates, early, middle, and late, for the Pharaoh of the Exodus. This is only one time. And if you don't have this kind of scenario, you don't have the Pharaoh. So there he is, Tutmosis IV. Oh, I think I do have a couple of slides. Oh, this is good. When Tutmosis IV was in power, here's the power ratings. Egypt was number 1, Mitanni was number 2, Hatti was 3, and Assyria was 4. Upon the death, I mean within months after the death of Tutmosis IV, Hatti had gone to number 1, Assyria had risen to number 2, Egypt was a distant third, and Mitanni ceased to exist. I mean, that's a quick power turnaround in barely in one Pharaoh's reign.
And you said
Pretty
Tutmosis IV reigned only, 10 years?
8 to 10.
8 to 10.
Yeah. And not only that, by the way, here are the players. Isn't it cool to be able to look into the face of the actual rulers? We have them all the mummies. This is Tutmosis III. By the way, they all came with toe tags and identifications when they were discovered, hidden away, all gathered into 2 different tombs. Because people in antiquity were robbing the graves, and the Egyptians got sick of that, so they gathered them all up, secreted them away in a couple of tombs, covered it over, and
Don't you think it's a
protected
God thing that we've got all these put together?
it's amazing. Here it is, Tutmosis III, the grandfather of the Pharaoh of the Exodus. It's during his reign, in his court, that Moses grows up. Here's his son, Amenhotep II. He's the fiendishly nasty Pharaoh who's in power, probably from whom Moses had to flee. By the way, well, it doesn't say that there were a bunch of different pharaohs. Looks like all one Pharaoh. Well, that's because the guy's name is Pharaoh. In the 18th dynasty, you cannot call the Pharaoh by his name. Can't do it. It's not protocol. Even in the Amarna letters, over 300 letters written in the same time frame, written to the pharaohs of Egypt. Never once is the name of the pharaoh mentioned. They just say Pharaoh. And so the story just says, and Pharaoh did this, and Pharaoh did this, and then he died. So we probably got at least 3 pharaohs in the sequence of Exodus. But he's just called Pharaoh. There could be 2 different pharaohs at any given moment. All right. Amenhotep II. Then Tutmosis IV and his mother, Tia. And here is the cartouche. And Men, Kefer, Ra. The Ra always gets the top billing here. Men, Kefer, Ra, that's his throne name. And here he is. One depiction of Tutmosis IV. I like this one. Doesn't this just look like a guy who would go chasing after the Israelites on his chariot to bring them back? He fancied himself as the greatest charioteer in Egypt. And there's his name, in Kephirah. Riding over who? Who are all these bearded dudes? These are all Canaanites. Here he is.
Oh, looks so good.
Tutmosis IV. Yeah, you should look so good after 3,500 years.
He's got hair.
Now, his mummy is really interesting. In G. Elliott Smith's published analysis of all the forensic analysis of all the mummies of the 18th and 19th dynasties, published around the turn of the 19th century, about 1900, turn of the 20th century. By the way, which was republished less than 10 years ago, because a whole new forensic team got together and re-examined the mummies and decided G. Elliott Smith's analysis was so good they didn't really need to write up a new report. So the British Museum republished G. Elliott Smith's volume. And what did they say about Tutmosis IV? It was the most interesting little comment in G. Elliott Smith's analysis of Tutmosis IV. He said, he's handsome, he has really nice hair, he has nice pierced ears, see his pierced ears, he's well manicured, extremely good health, young, between age 25 and 30, and at the time of death, he was an extremely emaciated man. That's what G. Elliott Smith said. At the time of death, this mummy was an extremely emaciated individual. Now, I thought that the reason I thought that was a funny statement is that they all look like beef jerky to me. I mean, how do you tell that this guy was they all look emaciated to me? But he just, I guess, the suppleness of his muscles. This guy was worried, sick, and pining away. Young, healthy, and not eating well. Something was happening that was causing him severe problems. Well, there he is. And we'll end it there with Tutmosis III. I think this is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. I just don't see any other way around it.
Can you talk a little bit about the monotheistic religion that occurred with
Yes, I really think that was a response to the fact that Egypt had been declining, that he could do nothing about it. Akhenaten could do nothing about it. The gods of Egypt were powerless to do anything about this decline. And so it's possible that he did a little research about how this all happened and hears of this fellow Moses, or this great leader, who served the one true God, and possibly he's trying to resurrect him in Egypt. He's trying to bring about a change. And this God is really interesting in the depictions of it. The depiction is a disk of the sun with little rays coming down with little hands, just dozens of little hands. He's just taking care of you. And he's very tender with his wife and his children. And very tender scenes. Never before. The art just takes a completely different turn. Now, it doesn't work, because Egypt just keeps sliding and eventually collapses. But it's an interesting take. By the way, Tutmosis III, when his grandson is born, Tutmosis IV, when his grandson is born, who is Akhenaten, who is this fellow. Akhenaten is not, he's born Amenhotep IV. He's not born as Akhenaten. He's born Amenhotep IV. He himself takes the initiative to change the religion and changes his name to Akhenaten, the beloved of the Aten. And he moves the capital from Thebes all the way out into the desert in Middle Egypt to a place called Tel El Amarna. That's the name of it today. And his name for his capital was Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. But it was such a terrible time in Egypt that, you remember Horemheb, when Horemheb came to power, he called Amenhotep III his father and completely skipped over Akhenaten because he thought it was a horrible period in Egyptian history that should not even be remembered. He tried to expunge the record. So bizarre and strange things are happening at this time. That's my take on it. You can believe it or not, but it's true, I think. I don't see any other way around it. Yeah.
Wasn't his wife
Nefertiti. Yes,
for Akhenaten?
for Akhenaten. Okay? Any
Is there a
questions?
connection between just the names? All the Tutmosises and then Moses?
Yes, it's the same name. Moses' name is the same element of the Egyptian name Tutmosis. It's the same element.
Would that be normal
It's
for a kid
authentic.
raised in the
It's
palace?
authentically Egyptian. Moses is an Egyptian name.
Right.
So you said that Moses probably came in as that little baby during
Tutmosis III's reign.
Tutmosis the third reign.
It's
So that would
possible.
have been his daughter.
Yeah. And depending upon how long Moses lived, I mean, if you take the 120, 40, 40, 40, if that, if you stretch it that far, it could have been Hatshepsut that fished him out of the water.
Oh,
It's possible. The princess of Egypt. But he grew up during the reign of Tutmosis III. So did Joshua during the reign of Tutmosis III. Joshua's accounts, the writings of Joshua in the book of Joshua, are military battle accounts structured after the manner of Tutmosis III's battle accounts. The structure of that literature is exactly the same, and so it's obviously deriving from the same period.
How does Ramses II fit into this? Because I always believe after my reading, and I haven't done as much as you have, obviously, that he was the Pharaoh who negotiated with Moses.
Yes, that's based on, and we'll have to do another night on chronology. But, okay, I'm going to take you down and show you why he doesn't work. I'm just going to skip all of these things. Okay, you've already seen this. You can go to bed, but I'm going to show you this. Here are all the kingdoms. Syria, Mitanni, Hatti, Egypt. The fatness of the line is the strength of the kingdom relative to the other kingdoms, okay? Now, let's take it down to that point. That's the Exodus line. The Exodus occurs with Tutmosis IV there. I want to show you why Ramses the Great, other than the date is wrong, because the biblical date puts it back around 1400 BC, not in the middle of the 13th century BC. Now I want to show you something. This is the restricted historical time frame for Cushan and Othniel in the book of Judges. Remember, Cushan came into Israel to oppress the Israelites as the first oppressor in the book of Judges. And Othniel was raised up to kick him out. Now, Cushan is an Indo-European name. It's not Semitic. The Mitanni rulers were Indo-European, speaking an Indo-European tongue. Okay, Tushratta. Cushan is an Indo-European ruler or city-state king, probably from that era. Not only that, he's attacking into what was Egyptian territory for the longest time. And remember that Suppiluliuma completely destroys the Mitanni kingdom, completely destroys the Mitanni kingdom at that point in time. So therefore, that's the only time frame you have for Cushan to exist. A Mitanni king in this era, because Mitanni ceases to exist at that point in time. That's all the space you have for that to happen. That's one reason. And Ramesses is way off down there. At 150 years after this time frame for the Exodus.
So what date are you putting it at? Around 1450?
The average death date of, there's a high, middle, and low Egyptian chronology. When you average the high, middle, and low Egyptian chronologies, the death date of Thutmose IV is about 1406. High about 1460, the low in the 1380s. Kind of average amount, 1406 is about an average. What's interesting about that is the Septuagint date for the Exodus is 1406.
That's right.
Which precede the Masoretic text by over 1,000 years. So the Septuagint numbers are almost invariably better and more accurate than the Masoretic numbers. And so, that's exactly the right Exodus date for the Septuagint. And
1406.
so Ramesses begins his reign about 1290. So it's much later. So Ramesses just doesn't fit. By the way, Ramesses has no chinks in his armor. He's not as strong as Thutmose III, but he has no weaknesses. He lives to be 96 or something. He rules for about 64, 65 years. He outlives almost all of his sons who would love to be Pharaoh, but Dad's burying them. And and when he finally dies, there's no collapse in his kingdom anywhere. So there's no place to put the Exodus in there. Not if those events of the Exodus actually occurred the way the Bible describes them. So, anyway, you can sleep on that. The Hittites didn't come into the land until here. Right here. So in order to have Hittites in the land and no Egyptians, that's the time frame you've got right there. That's it. There's no other time. It's amazing prophecy. I'm going to give you the land of the Hittites, Canaanites, and Amorites. There's only one time in history in the whole late Bronze Age when that's true. That's right there. So add that to your 9 years.